Hey everyone, this is Andrew Mayne here with Bram Adams. I have known Bram for several years now and wanted to talk to Bram, one about prompt engineering and also just have you all meet Bram because I think he's a very interesting person. I mean that in a good way. I know I sounded kind of
Well,
like
a little bit. It's definitely,
yeah.
it was kind of a bad thing.
My grandmother had a way of describing. We had a friend of the family that was like an uncle, but my grandmother would go, he's a very peculiar man. But doesn't apply here. Bram is probably one of the most well-read people I know. You read what, 5 books
A
a
month,
month?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the even though this last month I did slack behind because when I choose these books, I don't really look at the page count. So I
Hmm.
kind of sometimes occasionally get caught between two books that are just like a few more hundred pages than I can swallow. Because the average book length is what, like 300 pages or so?
Yeah.
Around there. So like occasionally I'll get like two or three 300s and then just like Napoleon Bonaparte, 874 pages, and Way of
Yeah.
Kings, 970 pages. And you're like, I guess whatever.
And I know there are people that read people. I know our friends that read a lot more books. Like, yeah, but Bram codes. He does a lot, and that's the thing that impresses me is that you get a lot of other stuff done, and between that, you manage to read a lot. But Bram, do you want to tell
It's perks of
everybody a
being
little bit
single.
about yourself? What's
Yeah.
that?
I said perks of being single.
Yeah.
You get more time on your hands like that, huh? I guess.
Man, I my first year writing, how'd you write 10 books in a year? Well, one, I didn't have a girlfriend,
Yeah.
and didn't have a real job at the time, so
Yeah.
kind of
It's
worked
like
out.
perks of being a wallflower, but in this case it's perks of being at my computer at 24/7.
Yeah. So, Bram, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, well, A, thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I think of myself, titularly as a kind of creative technologist. That's kind of like the direction that I've been heading ever since kind of like post graduation. I studied computer science and then I became a software engineer and a developer advocate. And I found that I wasn't really happy performing those roles, at least in the official capacity of working under these organizations. And when I was really journaling and trying to figure out why I was unhappy and if there was a source of something that I could do to maybe alleviate some of these kind of parts of my life that didn't feel so great, I really kind of came across this notion of polymathy and people like Leonardo da Vinci and kind of like this inquenchable kind of thirst for knowledge as well as understanding. And I felt like, we live in an era where code is so powerful. And this is even before all the GPT stuff came around. And I felt like, why don't I use code in a more expressive format than I've been using it? Because I've been using it just for the purposes of furthering the business organizations that I worked for. So for me, code became then a mode of expression more than a mode of operation. And when I started thinking like that, a lot of doors in my life actually opened up. I started playing with augmented reality stuff. I started playing with Blender and 3D. I didn't really like the idea of making video games because I don't really play video games, which was another challenge because a lot of the expression of coding is done through the realm of video games. So that was another challenge on top for me to figure out, kind of. And then, I think the big shift in life, obviously, now everybody catching up to this LLM stuff was when you and I joined OpenAI back in 2020 with the developer ambassadors, and that was a really big deal for me. A, because again I was at a time in my life where I was still searching for that larger purpose, but AI in general just hit the nail on the head so hard about expressive coding. It was just like probabilistic coding. You don't know what you're going to get out every single time that you put the same thing in, but you're going to be in the neighborhood. And that to me was just like the perfect form of programming. It was just the perfect amount of like fun and creativity and control and autonomy that I think that I needed to feel successful, and I needed to be able to create stuff that I cared about. So from there, I created a number of small projects, some of with you actually, and moved on to slightly bigger projects as the kind of thing got a little bit more real. A lot of consulting. I built this app called Stenography, which was around before Copilot, and basically does like
Stenography was like the first like publicly available tool that I'm aware of that like will help you look at your code base, help you analyze this stuff. Because Bram getting to work with this stuff early on saw an opportunity there and created something really cool.
exactly. I think that at the time, especially, people kind of were aware of the fact that these LLMs would be useful for coding, but code in and of itself is so specific and pedantic, and you really can't mess up. that it was not a trivial solution to be able to search through the code space correctly and actually give good feedback from these language models that were effectively hallucinating and coming up with different stuff. So yeah, stenography was an interesting challenge, especially figuring out the kind of autopilot functionality, as well as figuring out kind of like how to climb up and down the tree of these different programs and kind of make useful output. And then from there, I got really obsessed with personal knowledge management. I don't exactly know how it happened, but I got really into this app called Obsidian. I've been journaling for a number of years at that point. And Obsidian really opened my eyes to this idea of kind of like capturing these grounded knowledge bases. And as we started this conversation, about books, I think that right now, especially like this year, I've noticed that, the era of the commonplace book is really coming back. If you're not familiar with commonplace books are basically this collection of quotes that you've picked up along your journey and you saved in one place. So you can almost think of it as like a guest book in an inn where people write their name of all the people who've stayed. These are all the ideas that have stayed in your mind. So capturing that, I think, in a personal knowledge management system is really important because it's not necessarily just kind of a to-do list. It's more of, again, alluding back to earlier in the conversation when we talked about like Leonardo da Vinci, it's just curiosity, it's codexes. And then you don't really understand, or know rather, when these curiosities are going to become real aspects of your life later down the road. Like you can't really predict that this thing that you read, 5 years ago will have relevance in a completely different part of your life 5 years later. And if you limit yourself from being able to use that recall and find these important quotes and highlights from your life experience, then I find that it's limiting in a way that prevents you from being creative down the line. So I've been really focused on that. And then I think recently, with the announcement of GPTs and kind of like the world becoming slightly more agentic, me, you, and a few of our other friends have, started.
We're gonna have a lot of terms to unpack for everybody. I'm gonna let you know that.
Yeah. I've been just running through a laundry list of random words here. Break out your thesaurus for this conversation. But with the world becoming a bit more agentic, I think that there's
all right. Let's.
Should we pause there?
Nobody here knows what agentic means. You got to explain it.
Okay. Yeah. So agents are, in my words, basically if you've used ChatGPT before, imagine that you had a really good conversation with ChatGPT and could capture the gestalt of that conversation. So if you were having a conversation about good hamburgers, and it says go to In-N-Out or Shake Shack or McDonald's or whatever, then you could take that gestalt of that conversation and port it to a hot dog helper, where it would do the same thing for different types of sausages or the same thing for different types of sodas. And you should be able to interface with it at that level over and over again, whether that's saying like, hey, it's me again, and I want to talk about In-N-Out like we did last time, or hey, it's me again, and I have a question about this kind of thing. So an agent is kind of like a narrowing of the model space in my mind.
Yeah, I think it does a lot of things. I think that's the kind of the idea of persistence is a very good example of what it can do. For me, it's the idea of there's the continuity, but also the idea that if I say, here is a task, like right now I'm working on a thing where I want to create like a UI. And right now it's like, hey, do this. No, not this, not this. But if I give it a goal, say this is the goal, it should look like something like this. I should click on the buttons and it should work. I should be able to tell it to do that, walk away, and then it can iterate on it. And then it could go use GPT-4V to look at the images and to compare and to do this stuff. So think about it as like, as Bram said, like there's the continuity, the persistence information, but also the idea of goal seeking, that you ask ChatGPT to do a thing, you get a cup of coffee, and you see a little bit of that right now when you tell it to browse and search for stuff, because it opens up a browser, it does a search. Nope, didn't find it. Says, okay, let me do another search. Oh, I think I found it. Comes back to do that. And it's been exciting for us to talk about these things, because this is the starting point when Bram uses, and I've never heard the term, by the way, agentic, by the way, until now.
Really?
When we talk about agents, though, when we talk about that world of agents, that is a thing it's just in the tiny little wedge of public awareness. But I think a year from now or less or whatever, people are going to really fully understand this, where it's like, oh, well, I told my GPT to go do blank, and every day it sends me an update, tells me this, or asked it to do that, or I hooked up a camera to it to watch my garden, and it gives me idea. You're going to see this idea of what it means when the interactions aren't just between you click enter and wait for it to return.
Yes, and I think you nailed it with that kind of description, especially when it comes to goal seeking. I think that goal seeking, especially when it's applied to the model's ability to be consistent goal seeking. You don't go to your doctor and then you walk in and then they say to you, "Hey, I decided to change my career. I'm making pottery now." You're like, that doesn't help me. You know what I mean? Like I didn't come to see a potter. I came to see a doctor. So I think that this kind of consistency is what we expect out in the world when we're talking to specialists in their field, and being able to make these agents specialists in their own right is something that's going to be very powerful. And hopefully we're right about this the same way that we were kind of right about GPT 3 years ago when we were geeking out about it. And, a story about that, I remember I went home in 2020 and I was showing everybody my laptop and showing them the GPT-3 playground when it was still in that kind of like beta period. And everybody was like, "Oh, wow, this is magical," but they didn't really get it. You know what I mean? Like they were kind of just like, they forgot about it the next day. And I was like, "Guys, this is really important. Like you should pay attention to this. Like this is very, very important." And they're like, "Oh, wait. And then ChatGPT comes out and, I go home and my grandmother's talking to me about OpenAI. You know what I mean? And it's just crazy how quickly, and not that it needed social approval, I think, to be useful, because it's been an insanely useful tool for me for these past 3 years in general. But it's nice to kind of have the world catch up to kind of like the vision that you're hoping for.
Yeah, when people see things the way you've been looking at them, it's great. I'll give you another example of where agents could be useful. So I've dealt with like I've had like some weird autoimmune sort of thing, like I have like skin issues, things like this, and I go to a doctor like, "Yeah, we don't know, no idea," and it's like, okay, cool, that's helpful. And I imagine a world where I have an AI that every day there's something published and it's going through there and looking at this and saying, "Hey, I wonder if this fits. I wonder if this fits." And I'm dealing with a very minor sort of thing, but people dealing with really, really serious conditions and stuff. At this given moment, there's probably nobody there advocating, researching, looking for you. And it could be a long time before you find out like, oh, there might be something here helpful, or we know a little bit more about this, or things to avoid. And I think about this, the possibility of when these things are out there in the world, just gathering information and bringing it back to you could be extremely useful.
It's just a smart RSS feed in the sense of like, there's so much of an information deluge in the world that we live in. And I think being able to curate that information to doing stuff that's actually, once it, let's say, for example, like you were saying, it reads these articles, but then finds a phone number and actually calls the phone number to get more information, or like schedules you a phone call, for 3 hours later. All of this is very much doable. And I think that, especially for people who have a lot to do, which is every adult, and a lot of these tasks aren't really direct or obvious, we find that a lot of our time is extracted in ways that we don't really like it being used. And I think that these agents will put us more in a position where we can switch that dial back more into our favor, where more of our time is being used doing things that we like doing, as opposed to things that we're forced to be doing because of tax season, or because of health insurance reasons, or because of commuting to work reasons, or whatever, you may have, or even some genetic malformity that you were just unfortunately born with, and you literally just don't have the energy to do a bunch of research on it. Being able to have these models do the research for you and have these conversations with your doctor on your behalf, even if it's like co-conversations, right? Where it's like, "Hey, my GPT says this, is this correct? Like, is this, you know what I mean? It's like, can we talk about this?" I think will help a lot of people.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about prompting. And prompt engineering is a term that kind of everybody knows now, but people still kind of question or debate. And I've sort of said that, there was two phases to prompt engineering. There was the early phase when you and I were there, GPT-3, where I call it was like basically prompt inception. If you wanted to write a blog post, you had to start off with what looked like a blog post and let it continue, and that would give you good results. Or here's my professor's notes about, this exam, and it would give you that. And you still see today underneath ChatGPT, when people say, "Hey, we got better performance when we had it take on the persona of a character, we did this." I'm like, yeah, because that's still underneath there. There's a layer on top of it to try to make it simpler, but the fundamental reason is still there. And it's sort of interesting to sort of watch these papers come out like, "We discovered this." Like, yeah, that was there in GPT-3 days. It's just, you kind of got confused when you saw this interface and thought I just asked for a thing to get it. And we saw Anthropic had released, they had their 200K model, and then OpenAI had their 128K. Like 28K mean the number of tokens it takes, like the number of words. And somebody compared them and found that Anthropic's model was just really not that good at recall across all 200,000 tokens. It's very, very bad. Anthropic looked at this and said, we should be getting better results than this. This doesn't, because they were doing evals and tests. And they found like changing like a sentence in the prompt dramatically improved the results. And we're finding a lot of examples like that now, where just one sentence or one thing there will improve it. Now, I think we're a year away from that being irrelevant again, because now that the way these models are trained with their RLH reinforcement learning human feedback, Bram and I were kind of early on complaining like, well, you're using the examples from people who aren't experienced prompters. So you're not going to get the best results out of this. So these models were trained, I would say, on the mean average and not like the super prompters. And I think now that we're seeing what super prompting can kind of do, I think that they're going to get better. But prompting matters. Prompting absolutely matters. How do you approach a prompting?
I think, I wish that I could say that it's more than vibes, but it's a combination of vibes and my artistic process and my computer science background. I think it's the combination of all three are what propel me as a prompt engineer and where I found the most success. Weirdly enough, there's a game to it where you can kind of be, as you meant, or as you were saying, like you can kind of give it the starting goal line and just say, hey, continue this, right? Like this is what you're writing. I know that you like tokens, just give me more tokens, right? And then you have things that are going to be more question and answer format, where it's like, hey, I say this, you respond this. I say this, you respond this. And being able to delineate between those two things, as well as kind of understand when you need to be more declarative and when you need to be more interrogative, is kind of like it's an art and it's a science, right? Like I think that it's a science in the sense that you can, for example, a lot of people still aren't using steps in their custom instructions and their prompts and stuff like that, where it's like where everything else in the world is a series of steps for the most part, right? Like when you're filling out a form, it's a series of steps. When you're doing a recipe, it's a series of steps. Yeah. But then like for some reason people get to their prompt and they're like, just do it whenever you feel like it, and it's like, no, let's do this first and then this second and this third.
In defense, I wrote the first prompting guide, or helped write one of the first prompting guides at OpenAI back in the early days of like, hey, this is what you do. These are suggestions. And there was a lot more that could have been got in there, but it was just like, put it in there and kind of assuming there'd be a body of knowledge that would emerge around that. But then I would go talk to researchers or people and like, oh, we looked at the prompt guide. And I'm like, it's not like a instruction manual. Like we don't know what these things can do. Like you have to explore, like whatever we described there, there's the capabilities are way more and you can get a lot more out of it. And there are things that I knew like internally, like chain of thought, and I never bothered to write it out. But like, and then the step-by-step was just, I had some early prompts that put up their examples of that, but you have to sometimes explicitly point these things out. And we see, I've pointed out research papers where researchers use bad prompting, and we won't even get into model training and how model training is still in the very, very dark ages, and people don't realize, how just subtle differences can change everything. But step-by-step's a great one. So step-by-step, basically break it down into a series of steps. It's how the model knows what it's accomplishing. It's great. I'm a big believer that with certain models, with the GPT-4 model, a back and forth conversation can improve stuff over time. Other models, they just don't. I think that's one of the things that people don't realize is like, as we saw recently with a major tech company that released a model that was supposed to be a GPT-4 killer, that may not have been, because they just tried to get the evals to the right point. And when you use some of these models, they sound so exciting, then you play with it and you kind of quickly find out like, oh, it just does that QA thing really well, but it doesn't do continuous things. So step-by-step, certainly helpful. I like to prime it where I'll go like, hey, I'm very much into memory methods. Harry Lorraine wrote a memory method about, how to memorize maps and stuff. Do you know something about it? And once it describes that, then I'll engage with it, because now that is in the prompt. That's in the prompt. Right. And so, prompting the prompt is a great technique. If I wanted to write in the style of H.G. Wells, I'll be like, describe the style of H.G. Wells for me. Like he's I'm like, okay, now I want you to try to write in it. So I would say
Right.
prompting the prompt is a good way to go about it.
I think that's a really smart point too. Just knowing exactly what you are looking for out of the prompt and kind of saying, hey, like I already have someone in mind, or I have an idea in mind, or a space in mind. I think that that helps the model greatly in assisting whatever kind of task, and as well as kind of managing your expectations as the end user. And I think in a lot of this probabilistic work, especially in the earlier days, was a lot of managing frustration for people because there were just so
Mm-hmm.
many things to tweak. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I can of course edit my prompt, but then I can change my top P and temperature, and I can do all these other things.
Top
Which,
K. What's
yeah,
how
right?
hey, what's the difference between top P and top K? Well, it's a thing called nucleus sampling. Do you want me to
Yeah,
continue? You know.
yeah, exactly, right. Which I think for a lot of people was what initially scared them away from leveraging this technology on a day-to-day basis. But you can make the argument that we've gone too far in the other direction with things like ChatGPT, where it functions so much like a call agent, where it's just call and response and call and response and call and response, that we've lost a lot of that willingness or desire to kind of like understand our prompts at a level where, especially as we kind of head into the agentic world that we were talking about, where we would trust them to run without us waiting for us to press enter every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the middle ground is to kind of like create prompts that you trust with a very particular set of tasks, as long as it looks in a very like way that manages your expectation. So if you're like, hey, I need this thing about memory from this person kind of style, if it doesn't match 95% cosine similarity with something that that person actually wrote, or the kind of like go to agreed upon notion of what this looks like, then you can automatically reject that response from the model and then save you and the model a bunch of time. And I do think we're
Which
getting there slowly. Yeah.
wait, big update for today was that log prompts, which uh, basically what that is, and when I first came to OpenAI, I had to write documentation about this. I don't know what they were. I'm like asking people, I'm like, okay, I get it. And basically what it is when we talk about how the model, as it tries to predict the next tokens or series of tokens, logic prompts will tell you the probability, like this was a low one, this is a high one, and that can be helpful because let's say if I ask it for an answer to a question and I noticed it has a very low probability, well, then I could be a little suspicious of that and be like, okay, this is maybe it's guessing. If it gets me a very higher probability, it seems more likely. But it's not really one-to-one with, being accurate or not, but it is an indicator. And it's like we talk about temperature and temperature, it's the creativity knob. I'm like, well, randomness, or pseudo randomness. These terms can be misleading and go take us down paths. But that was a helpful thing because now you can start to say, okay, if I want to have it, create distractor answers or other things or do stuff, it's useful in getting to the point of making, like the API part, I think, way more capable.
I completely agree. And, foundationally speaking, I think that some of these tasks are aligned and misaligned with kind of like what the world is expecting and maybe hoping for from these models. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I go on Twitter, and obviously maybe my algorithm is pretty heavily AI biased because I've been in AI for so long, but it seems like everybody is talking about this all the time. The conversation is just constantly buzzing around new model does this, new model can't do this. I got it to do this. This was a surprise to find out that it could do that. And I think that that's what's really interesting about these models is that like they can be n equals 1 useful, or they can be n equals k useful, or n equals n useful. And what I mean by those three kind of buckets is that n equals 1 useful is just a case for Andrew or a case for Bram. Like just help us, literally helps nobody else. I have a few scripts on my computer that would literally not be helpful to anybody else because they are just for me. Then I have a few n equals k type scripts, which are there's a cohort of people who this would be useful to. People who use Obsidian, people who, wear hats on video calls, people who are like us, you know what I mean, right? So like the hat wear app would be useful for people like us, but not all people. And then you have n equals n apps, which are apps that just help the general person. And a good example of that would be water or oxygen, where
Mm.
everybody needs those two things, right? So it's like you can't, whether you're old or young or, tall, short, race, gender, hair, bald, you need
One
water
of
and
the
air.
one of the things I've thought about is, we've had that experience where we show ChatGPT or GPT to somebody and they kind of go like, I don't know what it's used for. You still get that. It's amazing to me. There are skeptics out there that like, it's fine to say it's not useful for you, but that whole I don't know. I don't think it's very useful. It's like, okay, a lot of people find it useful. Find out why. Like that should be your signal that other people, other smart, capable people seem to like it. They could all be deluded. It was like the iPhone. Be like, it's just marketing. Like, I don't know. I think there's a little more to it than that because it's stuck around. It's still there. When I think about one of the problems that I have, and I think that other people may relate to, is that, I write books. And people go, do you use AI to write books? I'm like, well, not in the way that you think. Like, I don't want it to write the book for me. That would be like wanting to be a musician and saying, I want the AI to do everything and I don't have to go on stage. I love to write. Writing is part performance for me. I sit there, I sit down on the page, I have a challenge, I want to tell a story. Some people may want to write, like for technical stuff, fine. I think some people might just want to press a button, have a book come out with their name on it, which just to me I'd be very uncomfortable about that. But when I talk about writing, I realize, I break writing down into a lot of different steps. And I know that, okay, when I'm researching a book, I can take my previous book, put it in there and use that to pull up information about it. I can use ChatGPT. I have a book that takes place, the sequel to my book, Night Owl. The sequel takes place, a lot of it in Thailand. And I've got to look up names for Thailand. I've got to figure out what are these different regions? What's going on here? What's the name for this? Whatever. Man, it's so easy just to quick and ask it. And I realized okay, well, AI is very useful for me, but a lot of people may not think to break down the task of what they're doing. And so they go, could I have it write a book? Well, eventually, right now, no, but also writing a book is so many other things. I think that some people don't break tasks down or don't break the thing down. Is that something you would find in your experience?
Yeah, I think this is where the programming aspect of prompt engineering really, or the engineering aspect of prompt engineering, right? Where it's like, I have to break this down into a scientific method that I can get repeatable results for. And in that case, I'm going to need to break it down into its component parts. And I think that science is interesting in that way because, you get into a very ship of Theseus kind of argument very quickly, where if you take out every part of the human body, if I just started, taking off cell by cell of myself
I have
and
the Abrams
putting
book,
it over
by
here.
the way, on that.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
You
no,
familiar with that?
no, I don't think I have. What's it called?
He did a book called A Ship of Theseus, which is like this with a co-writer, which is this very self-referential book that's got all these layers to it. But
That's awesome. And I love that kind of Gödel Escherbach kind of, Dadaist kind of representation of self because it is confusing, especially when, if you've ever had like a meditation practice or something like that, you'll realize that there is no real self. Like there's a lot of things that can kind of like sit next to this idea of self and maybe compile to be self, but not to get too deep into that philosophical rabbit hole. But I think that with these models, it's something similar where every individual parameter or weight or kind of word in your prompt isn't going to be the thing, but it's going to lead you partially to the thing. But being able to understand the part that each one plays, I think, is pivotal to getting really good responses out of these tools and not getting frustrated with them. So for me, when we were just talking about N equals N technologies, for example, languages, I find a really good example of that. Like, there's people in your life who are good with language and bad with language, but everyone uses language and you might not necessarily, like this person's grammar might be slightly weak or their ability to kind of reference ideas in language or convey something eloquently or not eloquently is something that might stick out. But there is a skill to language, and I think that skill to language translates really well into prompt engineering, especially if you have a slightly mathematical bias in your way of thinking, because then you'll be able to really say, hey, I'm looking for something specific here, but on top of that specificity, I also want to be able to pull out terms that I will be able to repeat and get repeatability. So it's like, hey, I'm looking for a bot that's going to help me manage my scoliosis or something like that, right? So then you understand, okay, well, what is scoliosis? Scoliosis is a back problem. What is a back problem? A back problem is, relating to your spine. What is your spine? It's made up of a spinal column. Okay, now I've broken it down into like the physical attributes of the spine. Who helps spine? Spine doctors. How often does a spine doctor like live near my city? Oh, well, there's one 45 minutes away from me. Or like, all these other things kind of like start to compile and you start to build this almost writing worldview, like you were just describing, around your subject and around your goal. And once you start having these components of your goal all kind of sit within the same space, I feel like the prompt will almost fall out of you because then you'll start to say like, oh, I need to just basically write this down and see what the model says.
Well, yeah, two things. One is an overwhelmingly number of people who are in the dev ambassadors. It's a small group. It's like 8 of us. very much into language and writing. Very, very, very much. I write books. You read, you write. Buddy Russ, same thing. And that's one of the things I thought was if I said, oh, what is the outlier for some of the early people getting really into prompting was people who really liked language and who take it apart and who programmed. And I think that too, those two components, I think, kind of help why we were so enthusiastic about it. Second is, you brought up Obsidian before. And those of you that don't know, Obsidian is, basically kind of a second brain sort of application that lets you organize your notes, and it's extremely extensible. People run it. I think they've done it. It's like free to use. If you want to add other services on top of it, it's great, but the free version is fantastic. You can use it on your phone. You can use it on your computer. I played with it from time to time, trying to figure out where I want to use it. And I found that it's been very useful for me for prompts and to store prompts and to categorize stuff. And because I found for that, it's been very helpful because if I want to sort of, I used to put them in like text, like just little text files, which just kind of got everywhere. And I used to put them like Google Drive and now, or like my notes app, but now I've been trying to use Obsidian more for that because it makes it easier to iterate. Tell us some of your favorite stuff about Obsidian, some of your hacks for using it, how you might use it with prompting, plugins you've made, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think Obsidian is a phenomenal piece of software that is really good at a few things, and those few things that it's good at are parent to a lot of things. And what I mean by that is that it's just a really good file storage. It's kind of like an IDE for text, and if you're not familiar with the term IDE, it's an integrated development environment for us coders. Code is technically just text files, right? Technically, a .javascript file, a .python file, it's just text on a file, but it's a specific type of text that computers can read. So we use IDEs to relate our files to each other. And when I click this word, it'll take me to the definition of that word, the same way that if you were in the Merriam-Webster and you click this word, it links you back to the definition of that word. So being able to do that with text is very powerful. But text is a lot more fluid. It has a lot more lives than code does because code is meant for a very specific kind of utility, which is to turn into binary so that computers can run it as an executable, whereas language doesn't need to be run. And it's really run in people's heads, for lack of a better term. Like if I write something down and it does nothing, it sits inert, but the second somebody reads it, it could tell them how to bake a cake that they didn't know how to bake before. So, language runs in people's heads. So being able to have a service like Obsidian is so useful because it allows you to put structure to something that almost resists structure in a way, and you need to be able to add that structure by manually changing it. So I use Obsidian particularly as a few things. Recently, I've used it a lot less because I've had a time block planner that I bought from Cal Newport, which I use as a daily kind of like log for the things that I need to do. It also has a weekly plan section, which has been very helpful. But in the past, I've used Obsidian for those types of tasks. I really like Obsidian when it comes to its ability to write Markdown and then export it in a lot of different places. Markdown is just a flavor wrapping on text files that allows you to do headings in bold and italicized relatively easily. I say relatively because there is a learning curve to it. Plugin wise, I think that this is where the extensibility comes in. A lot of people think about text for their n=1 use case, right? And this is kind of a perfect example of what I was talking about with that n=k in my mind, where I built a number of plugins, one in particular called ChatGPT-MD, which was putting ChatGPT in the Markdown spec, as the title might give away. And I found that that was really useful for me because that was something that I wanted out of ChatGPT. I wanted it to just be Markdown files already so I could export it to my blog and do all these other things with it. But then 30,000 people agreed, right? Because you can see your plugin installs on Obsidian and how many people use it. And they also use ChatGPT-MD in a very similar purpose, I imagine. So there's that case of an n=1 app becoming an n=k app, where not everybody in Obsidian uses ChatGPT, but for those who do, and those who like the Markdown spec, they might be interested in using ChatGPT-MD.
Explain to people the experience of what ChatGPT-MD does.
Yeah, so it's functionally works very similar to the experience that you might have in ChatGPT, but if it were in ChatGPT in a text file. So it uses, I think one of the more creative things that I did with this build in particular was trying to notate what Markdown already looked like and not add any extra cruft to the spec. And it was really important to me to keep it looking like you might expect a Markdown file to look. So I use horizontal rules, which are basically those lines that you see that split HTML pages. to kind of represent ChatGPT typing versus you typing. And then it looks for a certain set of keywords to say, this is ChatGPT who's writing this versus the human who's writing this. And the advantage of it is that because the whole text is loaded in as basically a text file, you can change the messages that the assistant sent. And then it's as if the assistant said something else to itself. And that you'll need to have a deeper understanding of the way that the ChatGPT API works to understand that feature. But basically, it sends every single time that you send a request to it, it just sends a list of messages that have been sent before. So let's say that you remove the fifth message and replace it with something entirely different. The time that you run it the next time, that fifth message will be entirely different, right? Because you replaced it. It doesn't have any memory of that message before.
Want me to play the video for it?
Oh, sure, if you want. Yeah.
Let me see if I can here. I actually cannot play the video inside of there. So
there it is.
But if you go inside
Obsidian, the YouTube link. I think there's a YouTube link there too.
Oh yeah, let me see the YouTube. Oh, there is that. Let me load that up. But what I like about Obsidian, I like the idea. I think that these are tools that I think are kind of giving us examples of what are going to be the tools that everybody else is going to be using in some form of that. And I think that, knowledge management, tasks like that, actually just download the video. So let me see if I can just get that and play that. Let's pull that into a screen.
And I think, while you're pulling that up, I'll add to that. I think that the grounded knowledge of the lived experience is something that we, much like time, create without managing. And some people are really good at managing. So people who use Obsidian, just like people who manage their time really well, are good at capturing the thing that was already happening, whether or not they're doing it, right? So if you're doing time management techniques and time management skills, you'll realize that a lot of those skills are things that are basically managing some water that's already pouring out of your hands. So it's kind of like a funnel, and you're just capturing more water that was already going to be headed in the direction of downstream. And I think knowledge management is the same, where you take these good ideas that you've come across or created on your own accord, as well as the things that you need to do and the things that you've done, and you kind of put them all into one place where they can start to help each other. And as language models get smarter and the context windows get bigger, you can fully expect that applications like these will just be able to be directly passed into these models so that the model will have a very good grounded foundation of who you are without having to do all the groundwork of asking.
Let's do a walk through this, and we'll talk about that next. I want to talk about some predictions, because I think that we're very good at looking at the back at the past and sort of trying to create an analogy. But the problem is the future is it's exponential, and so that's harder. But let's take a look here. You want to walk us through what we're seeing here?
Sure. So the first thing that's happening here is that I am highlighting some text, and then I'm taking it to a ChatGPT-MD file and using the copy from highlight. So it basically just grabs what's on your clipboard. And you can see here, this is me saying, hey, I have this thing about The King's Man with Tom Hollander, and can you just tell me something more about it? So I hit go. It calls the ChatGPT API. As I said, remember, I wanted to keep it looking pretty minimal along with the markdown spec. So it should just feel like it's like almost like the Harry Potter pensive thing where he was writing to Voldemort. And Voldemort was like writing back on the pen. And, it's cool because, ChatGPT is writing directly into Obsidian.
But
that wasn't the pensive? Okay,
pensive was a thing Dumbledore stared into.
Right. What was it? So it was just a journal, I guess, that
was the journal. Yeah, that was Tom Riddle's journal.
Yeah, right. So it kind of functionally works a little bit like that, right? Where I'm saying, hey, here's a block of code, or here's whatever in this text file, go do something with it. And then ChatGPT takes those settings at the top there. So you can see there that there's the top P and the things like those are like all the API parameters that actually get passed back into ChatGPT's API. And then once ChatGPT starts streaming in tokens, I give those tokens back to the model. And I think it's just like a really interesting.
Yeah. So like on the server, what you're doing is you put ChatGPT inside of Obsidian. So now if I'm writing Obsidian, and I'm having this conversation, it's there forever. So if I'm doing some cool research or I'm doing something really neat, what's nice is that a lot of times, like I think what I love, the big improvement, that was made with ChatGPT is the sidebar, the conversations there. But here you can use the API, and I like the idea of it journaling and being inside of something, because like, the number of times you find something that's useful, but then you've got to download it and organize it or do something. But here you can just set it up and do that. I think this is great.
Thank you. Yeah. And I feel like it already kind of got outdated because a few months after I built this, ChatGPT built this share GPT function, which kind of blew this out of the water for me because I just use that more functionally because it has all these other plugins and tools. And then I just hit that share link and then I copy that link back into Obsidian or my website or wherever I'm using it. And then obviously the assistance API just came out very recently too, which also changed the game away from the chat completions API in general, because now it does context shifting and it does all the retrieval augmented generation, the file capture and everything like that too. So things have evolved so quickly and so fast that a lot of the time I'm just playing catch up, but also doing things that speak to me. And I think Commonplace Bot was that most recent project for me too, where it is a lifelong project because I do plan on reading for the rest of my life. And I plan on collecting thoughts into this large aggregate thing. And I plan on, I kind of did a pretty heavy build of it. So I'm pretty happy with where it is right now. And I still use it pretty much every day. But, I kind of hope that one day it becomes kind of like my community garden of sorts, where people use my AI enabled journal the same way that Bill Gates bought, one of Da Vinci's pages from his codex for $1 bajillion. Not that this would be the same kind of thing, but it's just kind of like a way to talk to this person. And I think that that's something that's like really powerful and uniquely cool about this technology, is that it's kind of the modern form of cave painting and leaving your own mark, where a lot of people are desperate to kind of like try and find a legacy. We are already living our legacy, and it's more about how we capture the legacy that we're living is the real science of it, or art of it.
The thing that is hard for me to wrap my head around, when OpenAI first came out with GPT-3, I think it was like 2,000 tokens or something. The limit, the amount of words that you could put input and output was a combined of like 1,500 words or something. That was the total. Any task you wanted to do, you had to fit it into that space. And, we would come up with really clever tricks for summarization and contextual sort of stuff. And, I built like continuous bots that could go through there using retrieval to just make you think that this thing was just ever ending. But now with models that go past 100,000 tokens, and you have people like, oh, there's this million token. Well, it can take in a thing, but to be able to reliably be able to use those tokens is another thing. But what that means is that it's you kind of want to say like it's short-term memory. That's not going to stop. It's not going to just level off. Maybe it's going to be a slower uptick by the time we go from, like, I think the upper limit right now is like 200,000 on Claude. Maybe it'll take a while. Maybe it'll take 2 years to get to an effective use of 1 million tokens on there. I don't think it will, though. When you get to 1 million effective tokens and a cost of like really reduce the cost a lot. We've seen with some of the new open source models that have reduced the cost of inference tremendously. I do think they're going to run into sort of a problem because it's you can only fit n number of tokens onto an A100 or this or whatever, and when you want to try to scale up. That being said, when you start talking about million token models or billion token models, literally a model being able to take in more data than smaller models were trained on, it's going to be a very interesting world, because it's like, well, here's your genome, here's everything interesting that happened to you throughout your life. Let me answer a question about you. You'd be like, yeah, how do I process that?
No, that's a foundationally interesting question. And I've felt, as the model context windows have gotten bigger, I felt that I've had to use less creative muscle, which is kind of unfortunate at times, kind of like what you were saying, where a lot of the challenge was to kind of like find the summarization that was super impactful. And then, when you really narrow it down into its essence, you can catalyze a certain number of other things where, when you throw more weight around because you have bigger data sets in your context window, it's kind of harder to be able to replicate that success, I think, from point A to point B to point C, outside of just the obvious, like, let me ask questions about this and find this inside the data set. It's more like, what are we going to do about it, right? So I think that that's a really interesting and kind of like complex notion about like what's going to happen to the world's understanding of information when information isn't really a bottleneck. By earlier kind of in this conversation, we were saying that language is inert until someone reads it. But that's not completely true, right? Because of LLMs, it's someone or something that reads it, right? And it can do stuff with that information without being told by a person to do something with that information. And that's going to be a really interesting world.
There was a very neat paper that came out from OpenAI, I think it was yesterday, the day before. One of the things they've been working on is how do you prevent Skynet? How do you prevent this from happening? And one of the ideas that finally got kind of surfaced was, can you use smaller models to monitor larger models? Can a small model tell you what's going on in a larger model? And part of people go like, oh no, the larger model could outthink it. Like, well, yes and no. People get sick every day from very dumb viruses. Like we've seen that very complex systems can sometimes, be in a position where they can be outmaneuvered by the ability to massively replicate, et cetera, whatever. There's a lot of interesting sort of ways into that. But they did as an experiment was to see, could they use a GPT-2 model to try to train a GPT-4 level model? And they didn't succeed at GPT-4, but they built a model that was like GPT 3.5 or whatever. They built a very capable model where the teacher was the GPT-2 model. And that was a really interesting sort of idea, because it also has this sort of reverse thing. It's like, well, can humans build something that's super intelligent? GPT-2 can make a high-performing GPT-3, GPT-4 level model, then maybe so.
And these that's a really interesting point, because what would that? I mean, there's pros and cons to that too, right? If that is the case, then a commando militant GPT-3 that's really easy to train 10 years from now can knock down 7 GPT-5s, right, or whatever, and completely capsize the running model. But then there's the safety procedure too of like, weirdly, I think that we put a cap on ourselves and in our knowledge and kind of like what we can accomplish. And, I'm a big fan of The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch, which is a book that talks a lot about kind of how knowledge is, humans are what's referred to in his corpus as a universal explainer, where as long as it doesn't break the rules of the universe, we can understand it, even if we can't fully grasp it. Infinity is a phenomenal example of this. The concept of absolute zero is another example of this. Things that do exist in the physical laws of the real universe that we live in as a part of, but by using conjecture and error correction, we can build up a Plato's cave understanding of the world around us and edit it in our understanding too, because of our ability to engineer things. So I think in a way, if the models ever reach that point or greater, they still might not be, it might be just a different level of infinity that humans operate at with our universal explanation, where they might have a denser universality explainer because they just think a lot faster and they think a lot broader and their memory is a lot better and they don't need to go to sleep every 15 hours. But like we'd still be able to technically do everything that they can do, on paper. And I think that's pretty interesting as a notion, because what that would entail is that there is a kind of maybe peak to knowledge in that it's not really graspable, but it is measurable. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of point where it's like, how much knowledge do you have right now? And it's like, well, I don't know. Like, are we talking about all the things that I've ever known or all the things that I ever will know before I kick the bucket, or all the things that humankind will know that I've just adopted? There's a lot of words, pretty much all the words that we've used in this conversation that neither you or I coined, which means that we borrowed them from somebody else, right? John Donne was a poet from the metaphysics kind of era of England in the 1500s. And he came up with a number of words that you and I use just every day. I forget like the ones off the top of my head when I was reading the book, but it was like very commonplace words. And he just came up with them. Like he just created them, because they were useful for the poetry that he was trying to write. And I think that there's a notion there that's, again, like really interesting, where it's like, where does your knowledge as Andrew stop and the rest of human knowledge start? And was it ever there to begin with? Is it just this effusive barrier of, I read this tweet and now I have to process it through my own mind and now it's mine, but then I'm going to say it in my own words and someone's going to eat that and then process it in their own head and it's going to become like a game of hot potato? or is it more along the lines of certain ideas try to kill other ideas? The ideas of like churches and stuff like that will, really kind of like heavily put their ideologies down people's throats to kind of like try and put them into a certain way of thinking or a way of being and try and silence other ideas. And that kind of tribalism is a very human thing, but it's a very mimetic thing as well, I think. And I think being able to understand the human corpus and as well as the human intelligence as we train these models to become more generally intelligent is going to be an important conversation that we have to have. It's going to be something that we have to draw a line in the sand and say, hey, human knowledge looks like something. And we can say that by using categories of analysis, and we can error correct and get closer to that something, but we might not ever be able to look at it directly. It might just be one of those things like infinity. It might just be something that we can get really big numbers on machines, but we can never have the biggest number.
Well, and there's the whole idea of the incompleteness theorem, but also the idea that there are patterns, and there are patterns of patterns and patterns of patterns, and that's kind of like get to sort of the grand question. Bram, I say we pick this up next week.
Yes, yeah, I got a jolt soon, and this has been really lovely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, buddy. Tell everybody where they can get hold of you.
Yeah, so I'm not much on the social medias these days, but please sign up for my newsletter at gramadams.dev if you want my thoughts delivered into your brainstem every Sunday. Recently, I've been on a nuance kick, so I've been taking ideas and trying to deconstruct them a little bit from the idea of like surveillance was this last issue, and I said that there are actually some forms of surveillance that are a good thing. And then in the next issue, I'm going to be talking about open source, but it's broadly just a journey through the books that I've read and the ideas that I've had, as well as some code poetry and some regular poetry too. And then
code poetry, folks. Code
poetry, which I think don't sleep on code poetry. Code poetry is a poetry of the future that a lot of people. There are a few people. I actually have a book that I'll link you after this that has some code poetry that you might be interested in. And yeah, I was going to say something. Oh yeah, and recently because of the Agent Smiths organization that we talked a little bit about at the beginning of this conversation, I've been streaming a lot more on Twitch and doing a lot of coding on Twitch. So feel free to hop into twitch.tv/Bramsies and say hello there too, while I'm doing these deep coding sessions and listening to music and kind of just molding. And I have a furrowed brow because I'll be thinking and not that responsive, but I am there. So it's kind of like an office hour plus a live coding session, plus a study with me, plus a drop in, say hi, leave type situation, and then get the code on GitHub. So that's it. That's about me. GitHub.com/Bramsies, Twitch.tv/Bramsies, BramAdams.dev.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.